everybody, welcome back to our live stream from Your Natural Baby Fair 2013. I'm John O'Reilly from Parent Savers. In addition to our expert and guests, I've got a couple special guests here, my two oldest boys. This is, what's your name? Whitaker, and this is Whitaker's 4 and Quinter's 6, and we also have a 1-year-old over there, Zyler, and he's not going to come on. So thank you so much for helping introduce guys, okay? Say bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. All right.
Have fun.
And thanks for that. And we're actually joined by Layla Adonai, a spiritual midwife, and we're going to be talking about conscious conception and holistic family planning. So if you have any questions about that, leave them in the comments below. There's a comment box, or send us a tweet. You can use the hashtag YNBF2013, Your Natural Baby Fair. And then we also have Sherry Christensen here as a panelist. So we'll go ahead and introduce Sherry. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Sherry Christensen, and this is my little girl Callie over here. Hopefully she behaves herself. She is
Nice.
10 months old.
Great. And Layla?
Hi, welcome. I'm
Thanks.
so glad to be here. Thank you for having me here. And I'm so excited to get to be sharing about conscious conception, empowered family planning, spiritual midwifery, really beginning to create the movement that's happening already around conscious conception and really giving more thought to creating the space in our lives, in our bodies, in our relationships to start birthing and growing the families that we really want to have in our world, and that we can become available to be the parents that we want to be and have a really happy life.
And so that process starts, early, right?
It starts early. Really it can start even 2 years.
Okay.
Even 2 years before, because a lot of times we don't realize for a woman especially like what it really takes for her to be pregnant, and then, we're looking at 1 to 2 years of sleep deprivation, right, for the mother and the father. It might be nice to build up energy for that.
And if you keep having more kids,
And if you
then
keep having more kids, that
You need to refill the tank, right?
Yeah.
The tank is empty.
Yeah. So to really start thinking, and then also to put things into place around the relationship, and that includes finances and intimacy and thoughts around parenting, So one of the things that I really encourage is a lot more communication and inquiry around, what are we going to do as parents? How do I feel about being a mother and a father? A lot of people want to have their baby, but having a baby is different than becoming a mother and becoming a parent and having a family.
we talked a little bit about this. I brought up the analogy to when we got married, we went through this process called engagement encounter. It was in the Catholic Church, pre-Cana, I think I've heard it called as well. And it was really mapping out not just planning for the birth, but planning for life beyond that. And is that what holistic family planning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of that, really. I think a lot of people, they're excited, they come together, they're in love, and we've had these images. I'm going to become a mother someday. I've always imagined that, having kids. But have we actually asked some of the deeper questions? And also, have we done some of the healing and the clearing of our own birth and some of our family? We all come with some family history, and I think most people would love to have had maybe a different childhood, yes. And so have we really thought about some of that, and how might I need to do some personal work and some communication with my partner so that we actually can have the possibility of having a family and our children having different experiences that we have.
And so then is your role to help people do that work?
Exactly. Through one-on-one consultations, through coaching, ongoing coaching, through classes and groups and things like that to actually, hold the space, because a lot of times that's part of it in our busy schedules, just making the time to actually think about these things, and having a time, if you already have kids, without your children, to be with your partner and be like, wow, and to share those vulnerable things. I'm kind of scared about having a second kid, or what's going to happen to our relationship or our finances, and to actually make a possibility for those. So a lot of what I do is encourage those deeper inquiries and explorations.
And do you do that with regular meetings throughout the process?
Yeah, regular meetings, and also even just one time. A lot of times there are, a particular kind of trauma, like maybe your first birth was really difficult, or maybe there's a lot of stories around, that your mother had a cesarean and the birth was really difficult, and so you're afraid, or the father, maybe one of the parents is in adoptee, and so they don't know their parents. But sometimes some of that psychological and emotional stuff is really in our space, and it's keeping us from conceiving or, really being available to have the highest, the best experience we could have.
I would imagine that the earlier someone can get to you or someone like you, the better. Ideally before you're even pregnant. But is there a point in the pregnancy where it's too late? Or at any point, as that baby's still in, is there still benefit to working with someone like you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Traditionally, spiritual midwifery, kind of in old days, was some of the definitions that people I've met was the woman who went with the midwife to help make sure that the spirit of the child actually came all the way in during birth. And so at any point during pregnancy, during birth, even after birth, there are so many factors to really being able for us to be present. Part of that now, let's say you have a planned cesarean, let's say you're having all kinds of effects from the anesthesia or different things, you may not be fully present, maybe things you need to clear from that. In utero, there are things that happen. A lot of my work is informed by over 30 years of doing hands-on body work and healing with people, and working with people of all ages that are clearing things from their birth and even in utero, where say mom had a fall and dad got real scared, or dad was off in the military or was working and he wasn't there, and the mom was concerned or afraid for being alone, and the baby is feeling those things. And so at any point we can acknowledge and feel and allow those things to pass through so they don't get stuck in the system.
A lot of it is really, it's kind of like being a grown-up. You have to deal with stuff, right? And so a lot of it is dealing with things that are there. And so when you talk about processing your own birth, is that maybe stuff that you don't even know is there and figuring it out?
Well, a lot of times what it really is it's really in our neurology.
Okay.
Because when you're born, and maybe you've seen this at your own birth, or if you've been at a birth, where you kind of like, whoa, feel kind of out of body, or you start talking to somebody about your birth and you can feel that they kind of like freeze and stop breathing, right? And you'll probably notice it after I'm talking about it now.
Yeah.
But all of that are signs that like, oh yeah, I have some trauma in my system. And so it's such the moment of birth, which actually isn't one moment as we know, it's hours, days, it's charged with biochemistry, thoughts, feelings, emotions, other people's thoughts and feelings, and all that stuff is really pulsing through us, and it's actually templating, kind of creating a neurological field for the child to come into. And so a lot of that is able to be, through breath work or hypnotherapy or other kinds of feedback, and even just going back to your parents if they're alive, or your siblings. What was my birth like? What are some of the stories that people have been telling? And then realizing, I'm like matched into this story, and that isn't the story I want to be telling. How do I change that story?
Yeah.
I have a question. It's interesting because I actually it was my birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I called my mom, and since I've become a mother, or even before pregnant, I have this thing now on my birthday where I actually call her to wish her a happy birthday day versus the other way around. And the last 2 years in a row, I've learned something new about my birth that I never knew when I was pregnant, and even before. And I think it's curious because I think there's so many benefits to learning about those things. But do you have any advice if people actually actively go to seek out to learn about their birth experience and then find out some sort of negative things? Because I think then that's a lot to process. If it was a traumatic birth, or if you were in the NICU and you didn't know it, or if there were a lot of interventions that the reason I ask is I think a lot of women then go into this pregnancy thinking, well, my mother had to have an emergency C-section, and can carry that in with them, and it can be a lot to deal with as you're pregnant. So any advice to process that type of thing if it's negative?
Yeah, you definitely want to know, especially if it was negative, because those are things, because as you know, as a mother, part of what happens with the oxytocin is that you have this short-term memory, so like in the moment, after birth, you're just like, now you're breastfeeding, and then you get home, and now, and you don't necessarily exactly remember. And that's part of what happens. Like, I've gone back, I do breath work and rebirthing through breath work, and so I've been asking my mother about my birth for 30 years, and every time I talk to her, the story's a little bit different. And I also feel like that's partly because as I do the work to clear, she doesn't have to keep remembering the one negative part, right? Because just like in our lives, there's this whole experience happening, and then there's this one moment that glitched, you know?
And you really focus on it.
Yeah, and so as we allow the story to be told, to let our mother tell the story, to ask her, wow, how did that make you feel? How do you think that's affected, how did that affect you as a mother, as a father? How did that affect? And let it actually run its course, because one of the things about emotions and about things like that is that we remember those things because they got jammed. So like if I'm on my way somewhere and I have a car accident, or I have a baby, or I have whatever, like what was just happening gets stopped. And so to provide some kind of a container that could happen through body work, it can happen through some kind of a therapy session, it can happen through just some self-care, to just even allow yourself, if you do receive that news, like, whoa, how does that make me feel? And also it might heighten your awareness. Wow, my mom was really scared when I was born. This stuff happened. And it might start explaining, oh, that's why I never felt close to her, because those first times right after birth we didn't bond because she was actually in some kind of a trauma.
And it's interesting that you kind of aren't equipped to get that perspective maybe until you're older and starting to go through it yourself to realize, hey, there's a lot of stuff tied into that birth.
Exactly.
Another thing that you guys mentioned was my wife and I talk about how I have a lot different memories of the births than she does.
My husband and I were just talking about this an hour ago, actually.
Yeah, because I remember a lot of details.
Oh, you do? Well, my husband doesn't remember anything.
See, and I feel like I remember more than my wife because I get the oxytocin.
She's in a pretty altered state.
Yeah, exactly. And she's got a lot of stuff going through, and so they're designed to kind of forget things. I wonder if talking to dads
would be a really good help, especially dads that are there.
Right, but
If we remembered every little detail, we wouldn't do it again.
Right, exactly.
That's why we need to forget.
Exactly. But then there's probably generational issues in play as well, because it's such a different culture around the birth of babies.
Yeah, well, and in the old days, right, the father wasn't even at the birth.
Yeah, handing out cigars,
Right,
sitting in the waiting room, right?
Yeah, waiting to hear, is it a boy or a girl?
Yeah.
Right, and so I think that's a really great point, and I want to really encourage you talking about that with your fathers, and also that the fathers to clear their birth trauma, because sometimes what happens at a birth is that the father goes into his own birth trauma and he kind of leaves his body. Or sometimes, because I'm also a doula, like the father, and he's more comfortable kind of behind the camera, kind of like seeing this through a lens, like it's happening
really
over there,
happening.
and like I'm actually part of this, you know?
Here.
Yeah.
Focusing on that, yeah.
And some of that can be your own birth trauma that I don't, and maybe it's even his father wasn't allowed at the birth and the whole thing's uncomfortable. So when we start letting it ripple backwards to affect what we do forward, we start realizing it's so rich, But definitely I encourage you as a father to be telling your children their birth stories and to tell birth stories to other fathers and mothers, just so that there's more birth stories known, because we also, just like when we go to the movies, it affects us. When we hear more stories around birth and the possibilities and all of that, it starts opening up the field of possibility for everyone to realize that they can create the kind of birth experience, the kind of conception, birth, pregnancy, life, family that they want.
And I think it's more, when you say more birth stories, I think it's also a lot more positive, because there's an unlimited supply of negative birth stories. You go to a baby shower and everyone has something, some horror story that they feel compelled to tell you as you're on your way to deliver your baby, or birth your baby. Sorry, I hate the word deliver your baby. But yeah, I think more positive stories too, and that can really help you sort of define what you want the experience to be.
Sort of like, the marketing thing where all the negative people with a negative experience will share their story a lot more than like the positive experience.
And I think the thing about that is it demonstrates that we haven't healed what happened, and that's another thing I want to say is it's one of the other big part of my practice is doing somatic healing, body work, and emotional healing for people after their birth, because your birth is never what you thought. It's always what it is, and it's a big deal. And so to really honor that, even if it's a miscarriage or something happens, that, you know, to really create a healing space for you to have that kind of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual holding for you to heal that. And then I think eventually we'll start having more of the positive experiences because the negative experiences got healed.
Do you see patterns a lot where things get repeated?
I
Like
do.
from generation to generation?
Definitely. I just was talking to a woman after I gave my talk about the conscious conception, and she said, you know, my grandmother had a cesarean, and then my mother had a cesarean, and I was like, no, that's not going to happen to me. And then after 5 days of labor, she had a cesarean, you know. And one of the things that I teach, because I also teach a lot around just menstrual cycles, I don't do a whole fertility program, but just that becoming aware that we have these cycles and possibility. And one of the things I share is how the egg that we all came from was being created in our mother while she was in our grandmother's belly.
Yeah.
And so this is really powerful to think that the egg, the code that I came from, because like your genetics is 50% of who you are, you know, was actually alive when my grandmother was alive. So you meet people that, like, if their grandmothers had a hard time.
When you mentioned that earlier in your talk, I heard a lot of sort of murmurs around the room, like people going, "Wow, I never thought about it that way before." And I actually have thought about it because I thought about it from the other perspective. I thought about the fact that, you know, hopefully my daughter will have children, and I had this weird thought where I was like, my grandchildren were inside me for 9 months. You know, it was just this really bizarre experience because, you know, we are born with all of the eggs that we're going to have for our entire lifetime, and most people don't think about it from that perspective. It was just fascinating, even to hear you say it again. It's just fascinating to think about it that way.
Yeah, and how beautiful. And again, that's part of the motivation for people to actually really plan and choose to prepare themselves. Because here I am growing these eggs that are going to be my grandchildren, and I want to provide the best possibility for them. One of the interesting things is that in the Eastern, like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, some of the most ancient systems, half of your constitution, your kind of, you know, who you are, is created at the moment of conception, is seeded. Who you are, your constitution, some of your well-being, your dispositions.
Right.
And so then also for conscious conception to really be like, wow, how do we want to show up for that moment?
Well,
I want to be rested, I want to be intimate, I want to feel open, I want to be relaxed, you know?
And so much engagement, focus, and research, that's already happened. When people are, I'm pregnant now, let's really pay attention. And so do you ever run into people then, or if people are examining themselves who maybe aren't ready to be parents, and you discover that, and what happens then?
It's just really compassionate, you know, really the cultivation of compassion, and how beautiful, you know, part of what I do in my work is to really honor how beautiful for you to be sitting here going like, whoa, right, part of me wants to have a baby, or I hear from fathers, and I hear from men, husbands, well, she really wants a baby, I want to give her that. And I'm like, well, are you up for being a dad?
Yeah.
You know, it's not just giving her to be pregnant. It's like, have you two done the relationship work to think about being a family, and a family that's going to last? Because as we know, the divorce rate and the amount of children that aren't living with two parents is pretty skyrocketed.
Right.
So I think there's really room for some of these thoughts, and also for some of the, you know, really compassionate holding for the people that do arrive with the, whoa, I don't know. And a lot of what that leads to is that deeper work of like, well, my parents seemed so unhappy and the world was like this or that, and they get in touch with their little child who still has a lot of feelings about how they grew up, and then that really begins to give them access to doing some of that deeper work, which can then change. You know, then you can ask the questions, well, what do I need to do to prepare to be that person? What are the things that I need to have in place so that I could actually feel really excited about getting on board with becoming a parent and growing a family?
Do you see more folks being engaged with their second kid or their third kid, or more it's the first time through?
There's a few people first time through, but definitely the second and third. And I think
Yeah.
because
You
people
don't know what you don't know, and you know so much more the second time round.
Right.
Or the third or the fourth or whatever it might be.
But that's
Yeah,
why
you
it's
hit
so
some
great.
bumps.
I feel like I see a lot of couples walking around that are pregnant, and because we weren't at that point, at this point then, I feel really excited for them walking around places that we're getting to hear you talking.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff here, and I definitely experienced that people are trying to figure out how do I do this in the best way now to have my second and third child.
What are some of the other questions that you focus on in some of your sessions? Like maybe talking about not just looking back, but also looking forward.
Yeah, definitely looking forward. One of the questions really, because a lot of people, it's very kind of magical thinking, and it's kind of a fantasy in a way. I want to have a baby. It's very romantic. So one of the things I really talk about is sleep deprivation. I'm kind of pragmatic. Like, okay, rubber meets the road. You're going to get home. The attachments of the baby and that level of intimacy and demand on you, and what are some of the ways that you want to put in place now, some of your self-care and some of your communication, so you know how to take care of one another when you really are.
I think a lot of people aren't prepared, and not to knock them, but I just think it's they're not prepared for the realities of what it's going to be like. And
Right.
part of that is because when you're pregnant for the first time, no matter how many times people tell you things, there's absolutely nothing that you can really do to truly prepare yourself for
You
that.
have to experience
You
it.
have to experience it, because there were so many things that people told me while I was pregnant, and I came to this event last year at 7 months pregnant, and I learned so much throughout my pregnancy. And despite all of that, once you're actually in the thick of it and you haven't slept in 3 days and you have a baby that's permanently attached to your breast, it's just an experience that you have to go through to
It's a
understand.
lot. And one of the things I do is encourage people to go and spend time with a friend or someone who has a newborn baby or a fairly young child.
Yeah.
Really put yourself into their home. If they have 2 kids, the noise levels,
Right.
really amped up. And just put yourself in that environment and give your neurology that experience, and then notice your response. And that's going to give you some cues about some of the things you might want to put in place,
Well, definitely interesting, and thanks to everyone for watching. Where can folks get more information about you? or
My
about
website is birthingbeauty.net,
Okay.
and I'm in San Diego monthly for sessions, and I also do phone sessions and Skype and all kinds of consultations and classes. So I look forward to supporting some of your listeners and more people. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sherry, and
thank
thank you for joining us as well. And as we've been talking about all day, if you want to join our clubs for any of our episodes, Parent Savers, Boob Group, or Preggy Pals, you can go through the process and enter the code YNBF2013 and get 50% off. It's quite a deal. We're excited to finally be offering a deal, and so check it out. Hopefully we can get some new members from this. Yeah, thanks again so much.
Sure, thanks for having me again.
All right, next up, Dr.